Greetings, this is Management 430, Human Resource Management. And while we have already spoken about labor law, we're actually going to dive into and understand how we do talent management different in a unionized context. A lot of the decisions that we make in a situation where employees are unionized are all dictated by the collective bargaining agreement or the contract between the workers and the management. So the good thing is, once you have your agreement on the collective bargaining in a contract form, it's very easy to be able to manage all the HR decisions that we need to make in terms of who do we hire, how do we go about it, what KSAs are needed, because all of that is outlined in the contract. So the challenging part of labor relations, of course, is the actual negotiation of the contract. That often can take upwards of a year and can be very difficult to manage. After the Wagner Act was established in the 30s, we moved towards the growth of the union movement. And so we found that there was a great resurgence from through the 40s into the 50s, and that's where 50s and 60s we were at our peak. And then after that, it started to decline, in large part because the manufacturing base in the United States has disappeared. So a lot of the sources of unions disappeared when a lot of the manufacturing moved abroad. So you'll talk about this if you haven't listened to it already in the International HR lectures, where we talk about the different ways that companies can outsource or offshore and how that moves manufacturing from the United States to other countries where the costs for that can be significantly lower. The most important reason why employees unionize is, number one, job dissatisfaction. They are not treated fairly. They don't like their jobs. They feel powerless, and they feel like they are being abused by management and taken advantage of by management. Also, bad working conditions. So if working conditions are unsafe, if they're expected to be unsafe, to work unsafe, if they are expected to follow and work in really difficult conditions without appropriate compensation and being treated accordingly with respect, those working conditions also disenfranchise workers and make them want to go to a source that can help remedy their dissatisfaction and their struggles. Lastly, as workers then end up with job dissatisfaction and poor working conditions, that results in worker disengagement. And we've talked about some of the concerns with engagement and disengagement in the first or second module. I think it was the second module when we dealt with that. And in disengagement means then they check out. And when your workers check out, they're no longer productive. They don't trust in the organization. They do the bare minimum to keep their jobs, but they won't do more than that. And even then, it might be fairly low performance. And so the more dissatisfied or disengaged workers are, the greater the likelihood they're going to call in a union and have the union organize the employees to give them some power and some voice in the process. Organizations resist unionization. Why? Well, number one, they don't want to share in the management of employees. And when there is a union involved, it adds another entity to the mix. So another union member, the union now enters into the fray. So it's not just the employee and the employer negotiating and having discussions and working out issues. We now have a third party that's involved. So that decreases the autonomy of the organization to make their own decisions about how they want to handle wages and working conditions and things like that. Also, it's a profit concern because it is a known fact, it is documented that unions demand more pay for their workers, so they will make more money and have better benefits. Now, the nice thing about that is, for the employee's perspective, there's a spillover effect. So even if parts of your organization are unionized and you happen to be non-unionized, there's a spillover effect. So if there's pressure to increase wages because of the union workers, that also increases the likelihood and puts the pressure on the non-unionized, on the organization to provide the non-unionized workers greater pay and benefits. And so this is documented. You can look at the research on this that's been shown. Unionized workers get paid more, and also they put pressure on the organization to pay their non-union workers higher wages as well. So there are some benefits to that. But from a profit perspective, of course, the more that we're paying out in expenses, the less profit we make. So the question is, will it put the company under, because they, it may be cutting into profit margins, but how much, right? So that varies from company to company. The smaller the company, the more those profit margins are much more testy. The larger the organization, the more comprehensive that organization is, and the bigger and more spread out geographically they are, then honestly, it's less of an impact on them, right? So again, the argument that we don't have enough money can fall on deaf ears if there truly is good profits that the organization's making, but they're not sharing them appropriately with their workers. Since the 80s, and largely because President Ronald Reagan undermined the union for air traffic controllers, and they undermined them, and he fired all of them because, based on their contract, unionized federal unions and workers who work for the federal government, even if they're unionized, are not allowed to strike. And the air traffic controllers made the decision to strike. They were putting pressure on Ronald Reagan to make more money, and he said no. And he said, if you don't go back to work on such and such a date, you will be fired. And in fact, he did. And that took a lot of the air out of the labor movement. It was already a little bit on the decline before then, but from the 1980s onward, we saw it cut in half, honestly. And much more pressure to not have unions. And so not only did we see fewer people wanting to join a union, but we also saw a significant increase in quote-unquote right-to-work states. And those right-to-work states argue you can't make anybody who might live in a particular state, a right-to-work state, you can't make them join the union. And we talked about this with labor law. And so, again, right-to-work states means, yeah, there might be unions there, but you don't join them. So hence the union membership numbers would start to decrease. What we are seeing, though, is greater trends in unionizing white-collar workers and service workers. So we see there are doctors that are unionized and nurses that are unionized, and faculty members. SIUE has a faculty union. Has several faculty unions. We have adjunct union, non-tenure track, and obviously tenured track and non-tenure track faculty are in different unions. And so the argument is, right, that the union will help to negotiate better wages, better circumstances, more consistency in policies, making sure that things are done evenly and fairly across the board. And that is the growing area right now. Places like Starbucks, Amazon, right? Trying to organize Amazon has been a really difficult time because they're pretty powerful. They have a lot of money behind them. And Starbucks had the same problem, but they were able to finally successfully unionize a few locations, and that's been kind of a good thing. Union membership is significantly lower here in the U.S. compared to Europe and other locations. So going back to our discussion about setting up businesses in a globalized environment, recognizing that there are unions in other places, that you may have to honor unions if you want to set up a business in a different country. Unions don't have the same negative connotation in Europe as they do here in the United States, for whatever reasons. So again, even though there may be some decreases in some areas, we are seeing some rise in union membership in other sectors of the workplace, and we are seeing you know some interesting comparisons to unionized European countries with respect to unions. So, what does it take to organize a union? There's a lot of steps that are outlined in the National Labor Relations Act about what they need to do and the process, the organized process in which they need to do it. Obviously, there has to be an organizing campaign where the union educates the workers on why they believe union membership will be beneficial for them as opposed to going at it on their own. And so there's an organizing campaign. There's information that's shared. There's ballots. There's meetings. Flyers, meetings, shared information, all sorts of things. Now, at the same time, you will find the organization will also be having counter arguments about why union membership is not good for them for a whole host of reasons. And there's some legitimate reasons that they can argue under the law, but they cannot tell lies about unions. They can tell truthful information in order to make sure that there's a balanced message that's being sent to the workers so they can make an educated decision. Ideally, right? There's always people lying on either side. I mean, it's going to happen. But at least the goal here is to make sure we are, properly representing the information that needs to be shared and kind of going from there. The union organizers must gather 30 to 50% of required signatures in order to ask for a union vote. And so they can file an election petition, and then the union comes in and conducts an election. Sometimes it's electronic, sometimes it's paper, doesn't matter, either way. If they get more than 50% of the signatures and the authorization cards, that means that they can request that the company voluntarily recognize the union. And the hope is that they would to do that, because if more than 50% of your employees want a union, it would be an uphill battle otherwise. And so you have to make sure that you have that level of vote in order for the union to go forward. If then the union wins the election and the company recognizes them, they elect officers, designated teams to do negotiation, come up with shop stewards who handle local complaints with the workers. They're the person that is the go-to person for individuals in each department or division where the union is organized, and the role of that shop steward is to help them understand and navigate the collective bargaining agreement and helping the workers to understand it, and then working as the go-between between the management and the workers on a daily basis. Sometimes unions can be decertified. So let's say a union vote happens, the union is voted in, but once the union got in there and they started interacting with people and they represented people, after a while the workers decided this union is really not doing what we want it to do. It is not substantively helping us. We're not better off because of the union. And that can happen. Doesn't always, but it could happen if workers are dissatisfied and no longer want the union there. Then they have to do the same sort of thing to conduct a vote, and then they can decertify the union. So there are a number of reasons why that might happen. It's because either the employees perceive that the union is not doing the job that it promised it would do, or they might say, you know what, we don't want this union, we want a different union. So we're going to decertify you and we're going to recertify somebody else. And so if there is, it parallels basically the same process. You have a campaign, you have information that's shared, and then the workers, educate each other, and then they do a vote, and then it proceeds from that point on. And your textbook talks about Kaiser Permanente and some of the challenges they had with certifying and decertifying unions. So it'd be interesting for you to read and understand that in the textbook. So you've heard me mention the collective bargaining agreement, and the process of negotiating the contract and the agreement between labor and management is called the collective bargaining process, which means both parties come to the table. They have to make a good faith effort to bargain. So they have to bargain in good faith, is what the terminology is. And they work through a whole host of conditions that must be negotiated. So uh, salaries, benefits, safety issues, working conditions, those sorts of things are all negotiable, right? What is not, there are some things that is management's discretion if they want to negotiate them, and there's a number of those items. And then there are some things that are just not negotiable. Like this is not an argument. This is what will happen. And sometimes it favors management and sometimes it favors labor. But there are non-negotiable things that will happen no matter what. The goal is, of course, in any kind of negotiation, is to not approach it in an adversarial way, although most people do. And it's like I win and you lose. It's kind of an all or nothing approach. But what we found is when we have mutual gains negotiations where both parties come to the table with the expectation that they're really trying to do the best that they can to help the organization be profitable and at the same time make sure the workers feel like they are properly treated and compensated, that mutual gains agreement can actually be less adversarial and in many ways has been much more successful. But of course, the trick is getting managers to agree to a mutual gains and to do the win-win and not approach things in an adversarial way, which is not always possible depending on the history of the union organization and the history of abuses on either side. Understand that when people turn to a union, it's already pretty negative because they're already unhappy. So that leads to that adversarial, relationship and atmosphere of, we're going to take you to the cleaners where you want all the things. But like any kind of negotiation, it's a give and take, and I'm going to ask for some things and I'm going to give up some things. And we're going to do trade-offs to find the best agreement for everybody involved.